Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Brawn Body Podcast. With me again today is Dr. Stephen Hussey. If you haven't listened to our first episode with Dr. Hussey, all about his travels throughout the world, his background, and his thoughts on healthcare reform, go back and listen to that. It's a really awesome episode. We also talked a little bit about his book, his new book called Understanding the Heart, Uncommon Insights into Our Most Commonly Diseased Organ. Great read. Highly recommend you jump over to Amazon right now and get yourself a copy of that, whether it's digital or physical. For more on Dr. Hussey, you can go over to his Instagram at Dr. Stephen Hussey. You can kind of click on his bio, check out some of his posts. He's got a lot of great content, and he puts out a lot of different links to pretty much everything he's done, from podcasts, books he's written, blog posts, his own health coaching and consultation business. He's got everything right there. So make sure you go and check that out. With that, Dr. Hussey, welcome back. Excited to have you on the show again.
Yeah, good to be here.
So when it comes to cardiovascular disease, which has kind of become your kind of subspecialty in a way, the numbers that we see in America are absolutely crazy. Have there been any kind of real numbers or statistics that kind of stick in your head about how bad our situation is right now?
Yeah, I think that one thing that's interesting is, I was just, we have to train and we have to get CPR certified every few years, as physicians.
Yep.
And so we were doing that the other day, and I realized, for the first time, I've done it many times, but for the first time, that they're so focused on cardiac events, like that is like they teach you how to help someone who's choking and that kind of stuff, but most of the time they're so focused on cardiovascular events. So if that doesn't tell you how prevalent it is and how much of a problem it is, that's pretty much the only thing they're teaching you in an emergency situation, then I don't know what else does. But to put numbers on it, I think it's estimated, I think by like 2030 or 2035, it's estimated that more than 130 million people will have some form of heart disease, which is a third of the population in the United States. And so that's pretty shocking, and that's just one chronic disease. There's multiple chronic diseases that people have, but a third of them will have some sort of cardiovascular disease. And I think one of the biggest issues with that, aside from people living poor quality of life and that kind of stuff, is how much it costs.
Yeah.
It's like $330 billion a year spent on heart disease and managing and treating heart disease in the Western medical setting, which is an astronomical amount. Imagine how much money would be saved if we were getting the correct advice and understood, exactly why it was happening, and were able to mitigate that, or at least lessen the effects of heart disease on people.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And one of the key problems with heart disease is it doesn't usually present alone. Very few people come in and they have cardiovascular disease. They often have type 2 diabetes. They often have obesity. They often have all these different comorbidities that present with it. And now you're not just treating one thing, you're treating a lot. And oftentimes you don't see them walk into the clinic right when things are starting to get bad. It's often, things are really bad right now, kind of that dumpster fire analogy. Everything is burning up. And it kind of concerns me too that we're talking about this now post-pandemic, because pre-pandemic, we were not in great shape. But what has been the effect of, sitting around for 15, 16 months at home, people not getting out, people not doing anything? I'm kind of been worried that the outcome of this is going to be worse than, some of the side effects of the disease itself, the virus, which is not to discount the severity of the virus, but we look at the statistics, not to get too caught up in the numbers, but by the year 2048, a study from Johns Hopkins had predicted that we would see over 95% of Americans become obese. And now we look at the numbers from the recent studies from Harvard, and we're exceeding the rate that study put out. We're moving faster towards that quota. So people are, really struggling to keep their weight in control. And if you struggle with your weight, your heart's going to kind of suffer as a result. It's got a lot more tissue to feed, and it's got to work extra hard. So have you kind of had any thoughts or kind of perspectives on what you think we're going to be looking at here post-pandemic as far as healthcare goes?
Yeah, I've actually put a lot of thought into, this connection between poor metabolic health and worse outcomes with COVID. I'm actually giving a talk on it in October at a chiropractic nutrition conference. Yeah, there's this huge connection between, things like diabetes and heart disease and hypertension and worse outcomes with infections. And we've known that there's plenty of studies that have illustrated that with H1N1 and all these different flus that come around. And so it wasn't really acted upon. We've seen that correlation, and we didn't really learn from it. And then something like this comes along, and it really exposes that. Because there's a study out there that looked at different biomarkers in people in a very big population, and it found that only about 12% of the population is metabolically healthy. When I say metabolically healthy, I mean like your body is able to take the food you eat and process it in a way that doesn't harm you. Your metabolism is working optimally. So 88% of the population would be at risk for worse outcomes with infection because of that. And the reason that is because all these diseases are driven by what's called insulin resistance.
Yep.
And so things that cause insulin resistance, are many. But when your body is insulin resistant, insulin is necessary not just for taking sugar out of the blood and putting it into cells. It does many things before that, but it's also a signaling molecule to a lot of different things in the body. It signals to the endothelial cells and lining the arteries, but it also activates immune cells. And so if your body is insulin resistant, those immune cells are insulin resistant too. And so when your body is trying to activate that immune system, if it's resistant to the signal that's activating it, then you're not going to get a very robust immune response. And that's exactly what we see with people who struggle with infection is they get this initial immune response, but they never get the backup antibody response because it just has trouble coordinating that because that's what's activated by insulin. And so insulin resistance is driving this huge, epidemic of heart disease and diabetes and obesity and all this kind of stuff. But it's also what makes us so prone to these things like that. And so if anything, if we fail to learn that from this pandemic, then I think that we failed in general as far as successes as learning from this pandemic in general.
No, for sure. I like how you bring that up. And insulin resistance really ties into another topic I like to look at called systemic inflammation. Basically, if you have insulin resistance and you have some of these comorbidities, odds are you have inflammation throughout your body, not just in one region. And when you couple high levels of inflammation throughout the body with overactive immune system, you end up with kind of like what you talked about in our Monday episode there, autoimmune things like type 1 diabetes. The body starts breaking itself down and attacking itself because that's what it thinks it needs to do in that moment. So it's kind of going back to these kind of complex signaling mechanisms and understanding that if you don't have an optimal pathway, things are going to kind of get out of a line, for lack of a better way to put it. And one small change, even with something just like insulin, is going to drive so many different changes down the chain from there. So I think that's really key and a huge point there. And that's kind of how in your book you talk about how cardiovascular disease has kind of been coming for centuries. It hasn't been something that just happened overnight. We woke up and it happened. So can you kind of touch a little bit on how something like insulin resistance has kind of developed over a longer course and time period? And it's not just something that we can blame on like high sugar foods and artificial sweeteners that have come about in the last 40 years.
Yeah. So I when I was searching for answers as far as health goes, it was when I started studying evolution that really provided me answers. And so, in my book, I start with I take it back all the way up to like the origins of life, because there are things that happened during this process from the origins of life all the way through the evolutions of modern humans. Certain things that we can pick out that tell us or give us clues, give us insights into what we need to be focused on today. And so one of those things is like mitochondrial health. So basically, multicellular organisms didn't really happen until single-celled organisms like microbes and things joined together with these other microbes that were better at using oxygen, And those have become what we now call mitochondria today. And there's plenty of evidence that suggests that mitochondria were once on their own. There's actually mitochondria on their own in our bodies. They found
Really?
them in the bloodstream. Yeah.
That's interesting.
They're just out there doing their own thing, but they're also in cells, and they allow the cells to use oxygen. And so that uses of oxygen is what allows us to be very efficient, metabolizers. And so the very origins of multicellular life clue us into some things that are happening today, because from that time, we get more and more complex organisms forming. Eventually we get vertebrates, and then we get the reptiles, and then we get plants, then we get fish and then reptiles, and then eventually mammals, and those mammals become humans. And so throughout that time, especially when we look at the evolution of humans, there was no modern day processed foods during the when modern day humans first evolved. And from about I'd say I could even say up to like 200 years ago. Yes, there was a big shift in what we ate, maybe 10 to 12,000 years ago, when we started farming, eating more crops and grains and things like that. But the biggest shift, I think, is when we started not just producing those lower quality foods when farming, but then processing the crap out of those foods and making them even worse, right? And so the point there is that our metabolism evolved a certain way, and it was that way for a very, very long time. And then in a very short, evolutionary speaking, amount of time, we went from relying on those foods, our metabolism evolved to do those things, to all of a sudden having to deal with these very concentrated sources of energy, these very processed foods. And so that could be things like, processed grains, processed sugars, vegetable oils, those types of things, combined with a lot of other things in our environment that are also triggering, insulin resistance and inflammation and things like that. But when we purely talk about metabolism, I think it boils down to those things, especially vegetable oils. And if you look at when vegetable oil started becoming something that was in the food supply, about 100 years ago, and you look at the correlation between that and chronic diseases, whether it's obesity, whether it's heart disease, it correlates, directly. Now, it's just a correlation. So we can't say that it proves causation, but it's a pretty interesting one that needs to be paid attention to.
For sure. And when you bring up vegetable oils, I automatically think of oxidation and inflammation, because vegetable oils, whether it's straight vegetable oil blend, canola oil, palm oil, whichever we're talking about here, they're so high in what we call omega-6 fatty acids. That refers to a certain structure of the fat chain itself. And we've known pretty much right along that these are not a good thing. Everyone's kind of said omega-3, good. Eat fish, eat grass-fed, pasture-raised meats. We look at trends from places like Italy, where, Mediterranean diet, high fish consumption, and they tend to be pretty healthy as a result. We don't often think of vegetable oil as the pinnacle of health. And yet, for some reason right now, if you look at marketing trends in our country, a lot of the products that we're promoting as healthy, like these plant-based burgers and plant meats, one of the first ingredients in them every time is vegetable oil, palm oil, something like that. So it's kind of ironic to me that something that we know kind of attacks our body at that mitochondrial level is being promoted as a health product or a healthy alternative to things. And I can't quite wrap my head around why that is. Like, yes, it's plant-based, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's automatically better for us, right?
Yeah, well, the original thing was that these polyunsaturated fats, these vegetable oils or margarines or things like that, they lowered cholesterol.
Yep.
And that's because they compete with cholesterol for absorption in the gut, and so we get a lower amount of cholesterol absorbed, and we're absorbing phytosterol, which is the plant fat, which plants use. And we can use that, but it's not good for us to use a lot of it. And yeah, everybody talks about omega-6, omega-3, and how our omega-6s are way too high. And then they say, okay, we got to take all these omega-3 supplements. And I would say, well, actually we need to decrease the amount of omega-6s we're eating. We need a good ratio, and we don't need to try and fix the ratio by jamming in a bunch of omega-3s and still consuming a bunch of omega-6. Let's make a good ratio, because omega-6s are necessary. They're very important for health. They play, a role for when we do need an inflammatory reaction to happen in the body. But when we get them in the amounts that people are usually getting them, that becomes a big problem. And they directly break our metabolism, from what I've seen.
For sure. For sure. And I like how you said too, the omega-6 kind of impacts the cholesterol a little bit. That's why we first jumped there. But you would think we've done a lot more research lately to kind of find that just because you eat a high cholesterol diet doesn't necessarily mean that your cholesterol score is going to be very high. So, for example, most of my followers know I eat a lot of eggs, but I eat high quality eggs. They're pasture raised chickens. They, roam free. I get the good ones, but I eat 5 or 6 of these a day. So you look at the cholesterol intake and it's like 300 or 400% the daily recommended value. And yet my cholesterol score's fine. So it's kind of ironic how we get caught up in these very kind of small details sometimes. And we say, oh, well, this competes with cholesterol. It's going to lower cholesterol. That's a good thing. And yet we don't often look at some of the other data and say, okay, well, people that eat a lot of foods that are fried, for example, in these vegetable oils tend to have higher cholesterol scores than people who don't eat fried foods. Why is that? So I think that's kind of an interesting point, and we could probably talk at length about the role of cholesterol, but kind of pulling back to mitochondria a little bit more, because I know that's kind of a big point that you like to focus in on too, is the metabolic health and the metabolic chain, so to speak. I mean, for lack of a better way to put it, it seems like everything we do right now is attacking our mitochondria, not just from a dietary perspective, but a lifestyle perspective. People are sitting down, people are sedentary, people aren't moving around and exercising, expending energy like humans were meant to do evolutionarily. There was a Ben Greenfield podcast, actually, I listened to a while back. I forget the guy's name he had on. He was kind of a ancestral kind of guy, and he studied different archaeological and paleontological evidence of our ancestors. And he said, yeah, the hunting bows they used had the equivalent of 120-pound draw weight. And this is a long bow. And I stopped and thought about that. And I'm thinking, how many people do you know right now that are currently in the shape to pull a bow back with 120-pound draw weight, hold it there for about 8 to 10 seconds, hold it steady while they can aim it, and then let it go? I mean, the evolutionarily mismatching that we have going on in our kind of species right now is concerning. So are there any other kind of lifestyle factors that you've kind of studied up on or looked into that kind of throw that metabolic health out of whack, out of line, for lack of a better way to put it?
Yeah. So with metabolic health, you want optimally functioning mitochondria, because those are the structures in our cells that allow us to use oxygen and use substrates from the foods that we eat. The energy and the chemical bonds from the foods we eat, and make our currency of energy that keeps us alive. And so keeping those mitochondria functioning and able to use oxygen is very, very important. And so things that we can do, or things that I guess in our environment that, damage that mitochondria. One is metabolizing the wrong foods. And again, this seems to be directly linked in my head, from what I've seen, to vegetable oils. And when we metabolize those, it sends signals to our bodies that break our metabolism. And so that's one way that those mitochondria can be almost divorced from their natural way of functioning. But then there's also external things that can then get into the cells, and these things come from our environment. So these can be like toxin exposure, and the different man-made chemicals that we're exposed to, and the heavy metals and things like that. It could be psychological stress, because we are very surrounded with a bunch of, I would call them, unnatural modern day stresses that our physiology is not quite equipped for. It is things like inactivity, and just not stimulating the body to that extent, and not getting the hormetic stresses, which is like a stress that ends up being a net positive from that. I mean, It could be things like endotoxins.
Hmm.
So when we have people have leaky gut or poor dental health, they can get endotoxins leaking into the bloodstream. And all these things can directly damage the mitochondria. And when the mitochondria is damaged, the body cannot use oxygen to make ATP, because those are the structures that allow it to do that. And so when that happens, the cell has to revert to what we call fermentation.
Yep.
And so fermentation is something that will get us some ATP, but not very much. It also creates more lactic acid in the cells, which is, the thing that makes your muscles burn when you work out, which short term is a good thing. It's going to create a stimulus that creates something stronger. But if it's what your cell's doing all the time, that's not necessarily a good thing.
Hmm.
And so when we have broken metabolism from all these different stimuli, that's what happens. It happens at a cellular level, and then it just represents itself at a whole body level when you end up being fatigued. You end up having inflammation, autoimmunity, all these different things. But it starts from damage to those structures that allow us to use oxygen, those mitochondria.
Right. And like you just said, it's kind of a complex thing because of the way we're living right now. We're using products that did not exist hundreds of years ago. And one of the things you mentioned that really stuck out to me was the heavy metal presence. Heavy metals are in everything right now. Like, go look at your deodorant or any of your, health and beauty and skincare products, and you look at the list and it's like, wait a second, we put aluminum in that? Why is that in there? And then we think about, well, our skin tends to be pretty absorbent. We absorb aluminum anytime we put deodorant on. Well, if you live in an area where you're putting a lot of deodorant on, guess what? Your heavy metal levels are going to be higher than somewhere else. You mentioned leaky gut and kind of gut inflammation. And, we just think about something simple like candida overgrowth. So just some imbalance in the microbiome, too much of one bad thing, not enough of some good things. And this is so prevalent. Hundreds of millions of people are thought to be impacted. We haven't collected stool samples of everyone in the country for obvious reasons. But, this is something that's so common, and we don't really recognize it because we don't think to test for it. We don't think to test for heavy metal presence and gut inflammation and food sensitivities. So I kind of wonder, kind of continuing with our discussion from Monday, what our healthcare system would look like if we kind of started with what's the root cause of these symptoms and not treat the symptoms.
Yeah, exactly. And, and not finding out how all these stimuli are affecting us and ultimately, manifesting into these chronic diseases that we're seeing, and rather than look at the symptoms of the diseases that are being created and trying to suppress the symptoms with the drugs, we need to look at these root causes and how we can help people identify them in their lives and mitigate them the best they can. And, something that everybody can control for the most part is diet. They can also, somewhat control the toxin exposure. They can try and mitigate stress. They can do these things, and it may be hard, but if you give them the alternative, which is just get sicker and sicker and sicker while we suppress symptoms, then I feel like if most people really understood the difference there, they would choose to, make the changes to get better.
For sure. And when we talk about all these things too, it's not just localized to, a population of people who have different diseases or start to have signs and symptoms. This is everyone. I don't care if you're average Joe, if you're someone who's 50 pounds overweight, or, an elite endurance athlete, ultra marathoner. All these things can make a difference, make an impact on you. Even that kind of endurance athlete population, optimizing your mitochondrial health will pay dividends to your endurance performance. If you have dysfunction at the level of energy production, what do you think is going to happen when you go out and try and run and run and run? There's a lot of things that we do that are really good, but not often are we rooted at that cellular level where everything begins, which is kind of ironic because we think back to like high school biology, and the first thing you learn is the cell. Everything starts at the cell. And then you look at how the world works as far as health is concerned, and we almost never consider the cell first. So,
Exactly. Yeah. Everything's based on, the symptoms, and they're not looking at the foundation, which is the health of that cell.
right. So kind of continuing our talk with mitochondrial pathways, one of the best ways to optimize it is going through that AMPK PGC1 alpha pathway. This is the pathway that we think of when we think of mitochondrial health, because we're promoting mitochondrial biogenesis, so the creation of new mitochondria, optimizing our metabolic health. This is the kind of things that we want to trigger. So how can we kind of go about our lives triggering this beneficial pathway?
Yeah. So this pathway is basically what activates, certain substrates, whether it's carbohydrate substrates or fatty acid substrates, and allows us to use them, kind of pushes them into the direction of, hey, we're going to break this down. We're going to use this for energy. We're going to harvest the energy in these bonds and make ATP from them. And so we want to kind of balance that. We don't really want to inhibit that. However, it's curious because, one thing that, can inhibit that is actually giving your body too much energy. And we think that, we give it plenty of energy, that's going to give us this pathway plenty of opportunity to send these signals so that they can burn more energy and make more. But if we overwhelm the body with energy, just give it too much, then we end up inhibiting that process. Almost like the body's saying, no, we don't want this anymore. And a lot of that is because we break the mitochondria. If we have a broken mitochondria, it can't use oxygen, then it's going to shut down the AMPK pathway. Because it's like, we can't take any more. You're going to have to do fermentation at this point. And so, the things that inhibit that could be, like we said, too much energy. And this is largely from processed foods, because, I'm going to steal from Ted Naiman here. He says, that, and others before him too, when you're hungry, your body wants energy and it wants nutrients. And so you're not going to feel full until you get enough of both of those.
Right.
So if we're eating foods that don't have enough nutrients in them, but have tons of energy, we're going to keep eating energy until our body feels like it gets enough nutrients. So I always give the example of a cupcake, very little amount of nutrients meaning like proteins, vitamins, minerals, things like that. But tons of energy in the form of fats and carbohydrates, vegetable oils and carbohydrates. And so we keep eating those, and you can eat a lot of cupcakes. People can experience this. They know they can eat like 4 cupcakes, but then steak, you can't eat too much of that. Your body lets you know when it's enough of that. And it's because we're focusing on these foods that have very little nutrients. We're not satiated. We end up overwhelming our bodies with energy, and that breaks our mitochondria, shuts down that pathway. But then there's other things too, like inflammation, which can come from a lot of different sources. It can come from stress. It can come from toxin exposure, those kinds of things, endotoxemia, things we talked about. Those kinds of things inhibit that pathway because they're breaking the mitochondria. And so when the mitochondria is broken, your body's just like, stop, we can't do this, and it shuts down that pathway. And so that pathway being shut down is a marker for bad things down the road. Bad things are going to happen down the road.
Right. And when we inhibit the AMPK PGC1 alpha kind of road, our body takes a different road that we call mTOR. So mTOR is kind of our main anabolic pathway, which in some sense, like you said, we need a balance. We need some mTOR in the sense that we need protein synthesis. We need to build muscle mass. But overexpression of mTOR leads to a lot of things like cancer and other diseases that we're seeing such a huge problem with right now in the country. So it kind of makes sense that when we inhibit the good pathway that we need more of, and we activate the pathway that, it's good in moderation, but if we send it into overdrive, bad things happen. It really kind of explains the root cause of a lot of our problems here in America as far as health concerns and society is concerned. How would you recommend someone go about kind of balancing mTOR with AMPK? Because it's kind of a delicate balance. We need mTOR activation, but we can't have too much of it. Like I said, even taking someone who has cancer, for example, they need to inhibit mTOR to help reduce the growth of the cancer. But at the same time, you also need to increase protein synthesis because of something like cachexia, so breakdown of muscle tissue, which is very common with cancer. So how do we kind of go about balancing that fine line?
Yeah, unfortunately, in medicine And in medical research, we tend to see things like, mTOR activation, and how if it's overactivated, that can potentially lead to problematic things down the road. And we say mTOR is evil, and we want to say it, we need to suppress it at all costs. But we never think, and I say we, but collectively as a society, we don't think, well, it was there for a reason. We need it for something. Just because we're overactivating it with our poor lifestyles doesn't mean that we need to demonize it, And so if we're talking about mTOR, yes, we definitely need it. And I'd say we need it to be happening every single day to promote growth and repair. And so mTOR is activated mainly by two things. One is amino acid like leucine, which is an amino acid, so amino acids are proteins. So we find that in things like red meat and protein sources. But then it's also activated by insulin. And so we can eat two very different things and still activate mTOR. However, if we activate it with insulin, the activation of mTOR is longer, like maybe 3-4 hours. And also when we eat things that stimulate insulin, it tends to make us hungry 3-4 hours later. So we do it again. And then we activate mTOR again for 3-4 hours. And then in 3-4 hours, we eat the same kind of thing because we're hungry again. And so now we have mTOR activation all day long. Whereas if you look at the other thing, leucine, the amino acid that we would find in good protein sources like animal foods, that tends to stimulate mTOR a much shorter period of time. So like 30 minutes, which is good. That's what we need to help growth and repair, especially, if we're working out and we want to rebuild and get stronger. But also those types of foods are more satiating. And so we don't end up eating those, 3-4 hours later. People tend to like intermittent fast because those foods are more satiating. They're full of the right ratios of nutrients and energy. And so we get the stimulation of mTOR in the more appropriate amounts, right? So it really comes down to, a proper, kind of whole foods diet with correct ratios of energy and nutrients that's going to create the necessary stimulation of mTOR, but not overstimulate it. And so when we talk about the things that overstimulate it, it comes back to the same things we've been harping on. It's the processed carbohydrates that spike insulin, and then it's the vegetable oils that break your metabolism so that you become insulin resistant, and that ends up creating higher insulin long term once you become insulin resistant. And so those types of things, those are the foods we need to stay away from if we're talking about balancing that AMPK and mTOR and all these different physiologic pathways that are happening.
Right. And the thing I find kind of ironic about all this too is we eat those foods, and like you said, we get that insulin spike and then crash. So when we get that crash, if we can't eat, we typically resort to things like caffeine for energy, right? I think America is like one of the biggest overconsumers of caffeine, like across the board. And now we start getting into adrenal fatigue. We also get into this attack on the pineal gland. So when you have insulin fluctuations throughout the day, insulin doesn't just store glucose, kind of like we talked about. It also drives serotonin into this place in your brain called the pineal gland. And serotonin is the precursor for melatonin. So now all of a sudden, we're having these random spikes of melatonin throughout the day. We're having these random kind of caffeine spikes throughout the day, and our adrenals are getting fatigued. And this one little thing called metabolic dysfunction has caused dysfunction throughout the body. On Monday, we were kind of talking about the different specialties in medicine and how it's great that we have specialties, but they don't often look at the big picture and how everything interacts. And I think what we're talking about right now kind of speaks volumes to that. How, one little thing, metabolic dysfunction, if you can't metabolize energy like you should, everything else is going to get thrown off. And I think, again, this whole conversation has spoke volumes about that. And, there's a lot deeper levels we can go here too. And I'm going to suggest people refer to your book for that, because just because we talk about things like insulin in this bad sense, you're going to look at research and you're going to look at textbooks and you're going to say, oh yeah, when everything's functioning properly, this is what it does. Life is good. And I don't think people realize how prevalent this dysfunction is. Like you said, only 12% of people are actually metabolically healthy. So while I can kind of pull up a pathway and kind of say, oh yeah, well, insulin is going to inhibit the neuropeptide Y secreting neurons in the hypothalamus, and then the neuropeptide Y is going to inhibit the paraventricular nucleus neurons, and that's going to have an effect on corticotropin releasing hormone, and that's going to suppress appetite. Like, yeah, that's all well and good in someone who's super healthy, but how many people fit that bill? Just because we read it like that and see that pathway doesn't mean that's how it is in real life. And we talked about that at length on Monday too, with the case study example. So yeah, I think all kinds of awesome information is being shared here. And again, for those listening, you really need to go check out his book, Understanding the Heart, Uncommon Insights into Our Most Commonly Diseased Organ, because we're really just scratching the surface here today. So with that, Stefan, is there anything else that you'd like to share with our listeners and any kind of final thoughts?
Yeah, I think that one thing that I think is necessary, we talked about this in the other episode, is that we need to spread the word. If we're going to change things, then we need to spread the word. So oftentimes people listen to things and that's great, and they use that to affect their own life, but it's like, hey, try and affect someone else's life too, because you may not have the reach of other people, but you can affect other people who are in your immediate life, and so just keep spreading that word, because it's just going to pay it forward, because that's how we're going to get things to change. So don't keep this information quiet.
Yeah, for sure. So with that, make sure that you not only share these podcast episodes, but share Dr. Hussey's page. I try to share his posts different times to my stories because they're very beneficial, and he does a great job at kind of synthesizing information in ways that anyone can understand. He's got the skills to take high level information and kind of make it simple so anyone can understand it, even if you don't have a background in medicine. So if you don't already, go follow his page, check out his information, and just even resharing his posts can make a huge difference, because you never know who's going to come across this information, who's going to land on his page, buy his book. I've talked at length about his book, but it is literally the best book I've read on cardiovascular health and physiology. And for those that know me, know that I have a pretty large library of almost 1,000 books. And at one point I was reading a book a day. So I don't just mean this as someone who reads one book a year or something. Like, I've been around the bushes a few times, and I'm telling you, this is as legit as it gets. So go check out his stuff. As always, thanks again for listening to this episode of the podcast. Make sure you subscribe, share with a friend. And if you're listening on iTunes, please leave us a review. So with that, thank you, and we'll see you next week.